Hi there. Now we're going to look at sections 2.3 and 2.4. Excuse me. 2.3 deals with subtraction and 2.4 is multiplication. So again, let's look at subtraction. Subtraction, what we do is we normally get rid of the subtraction and make it addition. So there's some rules to make it addition, and then we can just do what we did in 2.2. So here, if you look here, this is a subtraction symbol here. This right here is a negative symbol. What we do is we change the subtraction to addition, but when we do that, we change the sign on the following number. So in this case, this would be 19 plus a positive 5. So we're actually taking the opposite. When I do change that to addition, you're taking the opposite of the following number. Another way to look at it is if we have two negatives, we end up with a positive, which kind of brings us into the multiplication rules. So this one here, 1 would go with C. So that would be C. Now we're going to practice this rule, so if it's confusing, don't worry, just stay with us. And number 2, this is a negative symbol. It's just in front of a number. This is a subtraction symbol because it's between two numbers. So here we take our subtraction, we change it to a positive, and that 5 becomes a negative. Here, I'm going to do that on the side because I want to keep that there. So we have a negative 19 plus, we change that to a positive, and that becomes a negative 5. And then we can use the rules from section 2.2 when we add them together. So we don't really, I guess you can think of it that we don't really have the subtraction, we have addition, and then we use the addition rules. Let's see, this one would be D. Okay, up little d. Okay, let's look at this one. 19 subtract 5. If we want to go ahead and practice the rules, here this would be 19. We leave the first one alone, never change it, leave the first one, plus the 5 becomes a negative. Okay. All right, so 19 plus, you see, they use parentheses, and I very seldom do when I'm writing them. They mean the same thing, whether or not you have that parentheses with the plus out here or without the parentheses. So this one is B. All right, let's look at this one. We have a negative 19. We're going to change that. We leave the first one alone, negative 19, change that to a plus, and the negative 5 becomes a positive 5. So that next number, it's always the opposite. When you do change that subtraction, you'll have the opposite. Change it to addition, the opposite is a positive 5. So this one ends up being A. So let's go ahead and use that rule and go through some examples. And now you don't have to do this. You don't have to change it to plus a negative or plus a positive. Some of you can just look at them. You've done this before, and you can just say, okay, this is 55 and I have a negative 65. So I know I have more negatives. But you know, if it's been a while or this is new to you, you can go ahead and we have 55 plus a negative. I change that to a plus. That becomes a negative 65. Okay. Well, I have 65 negatives and 55 positives. So 55 of these are going to cancel 55 of those, but you're going to have 10 negatives left over when you do that. So your answer is a negative 10 because we'll have 10 negatives left over when 55 of these cancel 55 of those. Okay. Number 6, we leave the first number alone, change that to a plus, and change the 12 to a negative 12. So it becomes plus a negative. So now I've got 86 negatives, and I'm adding 12 more negatives, which is going to give me 98 negatives. when I combine those two. They have the same sign. I'll just add them together. A lot of negatives. All right, let's look at number 7. Here we leave the first one alone. We're going to change this to a plus, and you take the opposite of that next number. Right now it's a negative 11. So when I take the opposite, it's a positive 11. So you take the opposite of the next number when you change your subtraction to addition. If you have 11 negatives and 11 positives, they're going to cancel each other out. You're going to end up with 0. Let's look at another one. I have 0. You leave the first one alone. I'm going to change that to a plus. The negative 32 becomes a positive 32. So if you have nothing and you add 32, you will have 32. Great. Okay, let's do another one. We leave the first one alone, negative 90. Okay. And we're going to change this to a plus, and that'll become a positive 43. So when you do change that to a plus, you take the opposite of that. So I have 90 negatives and 43 positives. So 43 of these will cancel with 43 of those, and that will leave you with 47 negatives. You could subtract those to find out what that's going to be, actually. 90 minus 43. To see what that leaves you with. 47 negatives left over. Well, let's try another one, number 10. You leave the first one alone. You change that to a plus, and the 77 becomes a negative 77. So that means you've got 50 positives and 77 negatives. 50 of those will cancel 50 of those, and you're going to end up with 27 negatives left over. Yeah, that'll work. Okay. Let's go ahead and finish this. Let's look at number 11. You guys are doing great. We have a negative 25. We leave the first one alone. Change this to a plus, and the 6 becomes a negative 6. I have 25 negatives, and I'm adding 6 more negatives, which leaves me with 31 negatives all together. All right, let's try another one. You leave the first one alone. You change that to a plus. Take the opposite of the next number, which is a 4. And so we've got 5 negatives and 4 positives. So these 4 positives are going to cancel 4 of those negatives, but it'll leave you with 1 negative left over for your answer. All right. Let's see what we have on the other page. Okay, now we have a few, excuse me, let me move this down a little bit so you can see. Okay, I have a stream here of numbers. There's some subtraction, there's some addition. What we'll do is we're going to leave the addition alone. We like the addition. That's going to stay. But we're going to change these 2 subtractions to addition. So I've got 2 subtraction, one here and one here. So we'll leave the 22. We're going to leave the negative 47. But this is going to change to a positive, and the next number is negative 85. Then we'll change that to a positive, and we'll change that to a positive 93. So when we change the subtraction to addition, we change that negative 93 to a positive 93. So we've got positives and negatives. Let's go ahead and we're going to combine our positives. So we'll add these 2 together because they're both, how many total positives do I have? And you have 115 positives when you add these 2 together. And then We're adding them still. We've got some negatives here. So we'll add our negatives together and we'll have a negative 132. We have 132 negatives, negative 47 plus a negative 85. So I do know my answer is going to be negative because I have more negatives. So 115 of these is going to cancel with 115 of those. And what's left, if I subtracted those two, you would be left with 17 negatives. All right. Great. All right, let's try number 14. Again, I have a stream of this here. We're going to leave the additions alone. We like them, but we're going to change any subtraction we run into to an addition and then change the sign on the next number. So we'll start with 60. We leave it. Then we change the subtraction to addition. That negative 87 becomes a positive 87. Then we change this subtraction to a plus, and the 6 becomes a negative 6. Then we change that to addition, and the negative 19 becomes a positive 19. And we leave additions alone. They stay. Okay, so we have a bunch of positives. We've got a 60, an 87, a 19, and a 23. So we add those four together and come up with 189 positives. That takes care of all those. I just added them together. But we still have these 6 negatives. And when we add these two together, 6 of these are going to cancel 6 of those. And what's left? 183 positives for your answer. All right, let's try one more and then we'll look at some story problems and we'll go to multiplication. Here we leave the 22. That becomes a positive. And the negative 1 becomes a positive 1. So you always take the opposite of that next number. Here we have a negative, a subtract 11. So we're going to make it a plus, and that's going to become a negative 11. And then plus 9, we just leave that. So we change it to a plus, make it the opposite, change it to a plus, and then we have the opposite. So now when we add these together, we've got a bunch of positives. 22, 1, and 9 leaves you with 32 positives plus 11 negatives. And that's going to leave us with 21 positives. So 11 of these is going to cancel with 11 of those positives. So that leaves us with 21 positives for an answer. Okay. Now, again, you don't have to do this. Some of you realize that that's a negative 5. You're adding a negative 5. Here, you know, when you have these two negatives, they're going to cancel out and you're going to get a positive. So there's a couple of ways of looking at that. But this one would be, we may as well finish it. This is a negative 12. I'm going to leave the plus alone. I don't want to do anything. This becomes a positive. This becomes a positive, and then you change the sign. What? No. Can I talk to the, sorry, it's okay. Yeah. Can I talk to you in a minute? All right. Okay. So plus a positive, and then this was going to become plus a negative 5. So what we do, we'll add our positives together. So we'll have 5 positives and we'll have 17 negatives when we add those together. And those 5 will cancel with those. And so we have a negative 12 for an answer there. All right. So again, all right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at just a few story problems here. So we have Anita has a balance of $475 in her checking account. What is the balance in her account after she writes a check for $530? Shouldn't do this, Anita. What you would do here is this represents a positive number, what she's got in the bank. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding a negative number. So, or you're going to be subtracting 530. So she started with this, and then she's going to subtract 530 from that. Well, like we've done above, we can change this to plus and then change that to the opposite. So what happens is that Anita has an overdraft of $55. And Pearson may want you to put in the negative 55. I don't know, I should have a dollar symbol in there somewhere. So here, let me put the negative here so I can put a label on it. A negative $55. So she has an overdraft of $55. Now let's look at number 18. We have the surface temperature on Earth. Temperatures on Earth vary from 130 degrees Fahrenheit to a negative 126 degrees Fahrenheit. Find the difference between these two temperatures. So when you want to find you're finding actually the distance between these two. So what we want a positive value when we find the difference or the distance between these two. So we're going to take 130. We want the difference. So you subtract a negative 126. So we'll subtract those two temperatures, a positive and a negative 126. So like we did before, change that to a positive, change that to its opposite. So the difference between the two is 256. That's quite a difference. 256 degrees Fahrenheit is the difference between the hottest and the coldest on Earth. 130, I believe that boy, negative 126 degrees, that's pretty cold. All right. Okay, let's look at number 19. We have the lowest elevation in California's Death Valley at 282 feet below sea level. So because it's below sea level, we'll represent this with a negative 282. The highest elevation in California is Mount Whitney, whose summit is 14,000. So because it's above sea level, 14,000 will make that a positive. Find the difference in the elevation. So just like with the temperature, we took the high, subtract the low. We're going to do the same thing here. We'll take the high and subtract the lowest. So because they want you to find the difference. So we'll take 14,494. Okay, 14,494 and subtract the lowest elevation. Okay. And once again, we'll change this to a positive and change that the opposite to a positive. So the negative becomes a positive. When we add these two together, we're going to end up with 14,776 feet. That would be the difference in elevation between the high and the low. All right, so those are just a couple of examples there. Okay, that does it for 2.3. Let's go ahead and we're going to look at 2.4. 2.4 deals with multiplication. So we've done our adding and our subtracting. And when it comes to figuring out the sign on it when you're adding or subtracting, is it positive or negative, depends upon, do we have more positives or do we have more negatives? But the rules, I don't, that 3, okay, here we go again. I'm going to try to focus that. Oh, yes. But when we're doing multiplication, that's not what we do. We don't look at like the high number, like we have more negatives or we have more positives like we do in adding or subtracting. What we do in multiplication and division is we count the negatives. Now, When you count the negatives in multiplication, and this also goes for division, if you have an odd number of negatives, okay, then it's going to be negative. Your answer will be negative. Okay, if you have an odd number of negatives. If you have an even number of negatives in the problem, negatives, then it's going to be a positive answer. That's it. You count them. That's all you do. Odd meaning 1, 3, 5, 7. These are odd. Evens meaning you've got 2 negatives or 4 negatives or 6 negatives or 8 negatives. If you count them and you have an even number, it's going to be positive. If you count the negatives and you have an odd number, it will be negative. So let's go through this. Pretty easy. Maybe it's easier than adding or subtracting. I don't know. But here, let's look at the first one. We have 1 negative. 1 is odd. So we know our answer will be negative 15 when I multiply them together. Good. Here on number 6, I have 2 negatives. 2 is even. Even means positive, so you'll have positive 32. If you have an even number, 1, 2. 2 is even, it's positive. Here, number 7, count the negatives. 1, 2. 2 is an even number, so it'll be positive 48. All right, let's look at here, number 8. There's 1 negative. If you have an odd negative, your answer is negative 40. Let's look at number 9. Number 9, I have 1 negative, but I'm multiplying by 0. Whenever you multiply by 0, you always get 0 as an answer. 0 is neither negative or positive. So even though we do have 1 negative and 1 is odd, we're not going to put the negative there. 0 is 0. It's neither negative nor positive. So let's continue on. Count them. 1, 2. 2 is even. Even means positive. 72. 11. 1. 1 negative. 1 is odd. So that means it'll be a negative 40. Here, 1, 2 negatives. 2, and again, parentheses. So, and they're also looking at different ways of the symbolism for multiplication. Sometimes we're using a dot, sometimes we're using parentheses. It means the same thing. So they're trying to get you used to both ways, meaning multiplication or find the product. 2 negatives, 2 is even, so it's going to be positive 30. Okay, let's turn the page over. Yeah, we may as well. I mean, these really don't take very long. Here we've got 1. 1 is odd, so our answer will be negative 8. We have a negative number of odd. We have an odd number of negatives, so your answer is negative 8. Here, 0 times anything is 0, so it doesn't matter. It's just going to be 0. Whenever you have a 0 when you're multiplying, your answer is 0. Great, let's continue on. Here, I'm multiplying 3 numbers together. So go ahead and count your negatives. I've got 2 of them. 2 is even, so I know my answer will be positive. Because if you have an even number of negatives, it'll be positive. So we have a positive what? Well, it does not matter the order you multiply these in. You could take 3 times 4 is 12. 12 times 5 is 60. Or you could take 4 times 5 is 20. 20 times 3 is 60. Order doesn't matter in multiplication or addition. Either one, it doesn't matter, and addition. So here you can multiply in order. So you get 12 times 5 is 60. And I know it's positive because I have 2, which is even. 2 negatives, which is even. Okay, let's look at the 16. Count the negatives. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is even, so my answer will be positive. So let's go ahead and multiply. Let's go ahead and multiply them, knowing that my answer is positive. 2 times 5 is 10. Times 1 is 10. Times 4 is 40. So I took 2 times 5 and I got 10. 10 times 1 is still 10. And then that answer times 4 is a positive 40. So you can ignore the negatives once you've determined if it's negative or positive, and then just multiply the numbers together. All right, let's look at 17. Let's count our negatives. Will my answer be positive or negative? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is odd, so my answer is negative. So let's go ahead and multiply the numbers. We can ignore the negatives now because we've already determined what the answer will be by counting those. We have an odd number. So here we have 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 11 is 44. So you just multiply along. Done. Doesn't matter what the sign's going to be. I have a 0 as a factor here, which means that the product will be 0. Okay? If one of the factors is 0, your answer, the product will always be 0. Now, the next part, this really helps to knowing if you have an even number or an odd number, if it's going to be positive or negative, is when we have these exponents. Okay, now here I have a -3 in the parentheses to the 5th power. This means I'm taking a negative, I have 5 -3s. I'm going to go ahead at 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I know that my answer is going to be negative because I have 5 of them and 5 is odd. So when I write those out, I didn't really need to include the negatives because I already know what my answer is going to be. It's going to be a negative because 5 is odd. So I have an odd number of negatives. And then you take 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27, times 3 is 81, times 3 is 243. Negative 243. So now let's look at number 20. Will it be negative or positive? Well, I have an odd number of negatives. I have 3 of those. So I know my answer is negative. So then I just have to take 7 times 7, which is 49, times 7 is 343. So you determine the sign by looking if that's even or odd. I've got an odd number of them. So it's negative. And then you take 7 times 7 times 7, 243. 21. Here I have 8 -1s. This is even. So I know my answer will be positive because I have an even number of negatives rather than an odd number of negatives. Because it's even, I know my answer is positive. 1 times 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 1, you have 8 of them here, is still positive 1. Okay. Because 1 times 1 times 1, 8 times is 1. Don't take 1 times 8. All right. This means 1 times 1 times 1. 8. I didn't put the negatives because it doesn't matter. I already know it's going to be a positive answer. You get 1. So if I had -1 to the 31st. Okay, this is odd, so I know the negative stays. And 1 times itself 31 times will still be 1. So there you go, -1. Now 22, this is an important idea. If you look at 19, 20, and 21, they're all in parentheses. And all of a sudden we get to 22 and the negative is not in a parentheses. What this means is that you're taking, and the negative is not a part of the squared unless it's in parentheses. Then it's a part of the power. Otherwise, you're going to take 12 squared and you get 144, and then you have this negative that stays. So let's look at another idea. There's a difference between a -3 squared and a -3 squared. Here, the negative is not a part of the squaring because it's not in the parentheses. So you square and then the negative stays. Here, when you have, this means the negative is a part of the squaring. This is even, so the negative is going to disappear. Because this is even, you have an even number of negatives. So here the answer is a +9. So be aware of that, and we'll keep looking at that later in some of the other sections. All right, so that's 2.4. Perfect. So let me know if you have any questions. All right, bye-bye.